So the first thing I like to do when I start a scene like this is to bring in a scale man. So he's 180 centimeters tall, or roughly 6 foot tall. So he's kind of like just above average, but it's a really good way for me to kind of see the overall scale of the elements I'm designing into my drone. So I have a good idea in my head of what the drone kind of looks like, because maybe I've sketched it down a little bit on random envelopes around my apartment. So at this point I'm thinking, okay, I have a pretty solid idea in my head, and now I just need to really start kind of getting it into 3D and thinking, what about this design doesn't work, when I start to kind of make it into more of an actual tangible element or design, I guess. So what I'm doing at the moment is really kind of fleshing out the overall design, figuring out sort of what kind of scale I even want, because maybe I've drawn the idea out and I have a rough idea in my head, but it doesn't actually look cool when I do it in person. So this for me is really useful, because it's the point at which I think, okay, now I can actually do something that is sort of like really kind of bringing life to the design, and I can figure out whether it's something that actually just works. Because quite often I'll kind of come up with a design, and then when I start putting it together, it just kind of feels a bit shitty. So this is a really good way for me to kind of move on with my design. And obviously this doesn't require 3D. It could be that you're just really good in Photoshop or sketching or drawing. But where my talent base sits in just modeling, then this is what I enjoy. Like, this is like doing Lego for me. So this is the point at which I'm basically setting up a basic environment for it, so that I can use quite a fast progressive render to sort of see it in context. So what I've done is I've blocked out the very basic shape, and now I'm just killing the displacement that's coming on the floor as part of the scene I just placed in Modo. So all I want is a flat grey environment so that it's not distracting. And then I'm using a HDRI image, or a high dynamic range image I've grabbed from the internet, or in this case from Modo, and I've placed it in the scene just to light the scene, just to give it a cool, nice, contrasty lighting environment. And then I can sit and model away, and then every so often I'll bring up my progressive renderer just to see how it feels. And that's sort of like a very early stage of kind of how seeing it sort of not in context, but in some sort of context, and with the field of view of a decent camera, as opposed to the field of view of a modeling viewport, which is like pretty far off of a normal camera. And then I can see how well do those elements kind of sit together during my process, and just to kind of figure out the overall design. So that's what I'm doing now, and kind of putting it next to my scale man just to see how well it figures. So once I kind of have that set up going, then I just literally, this is my process. I sit and I block the shapes out. I obviously have an idea in my head of what things are. So at this point, I'm kind of thinking that maybe this is some sort of like radar dish or some sort of antenna. And the box I'm blocking in on the front, I'm thinking is some sort of camera to keep an eye on civilians down on the street, maybe capture faces in order to figure out whether they match some sort of police database to see if it's a criminal or someone we're looking for. And then this shape on the side, I'm thinking is kind of like the thrusters that you would have on a normal jet, or like the air vents that you would see on the side of an Apache attack helicopter that pull air in and through the motors to keep them cool. So all I'm really doing is, as I do this, is kind of just modeling away, looking at reference every so often on my other screen. But mainly I like to just really kind of get it into some sort of tangible shape, as I mentioned earlier, just to see how well it kind of works. I'm keeping the modeling very simple at this stage because I don't want to spend a lot of time on things like bevels or anything like that, because I really just don't know if I'm going to delete half of these shapes. So, for example, at the moment, I'm not feeling too enamored with the kind of antenna shape on the front, because although I thought it looked really cool in some reference I saw, once I've done it on mine, it's starting to feel kind of too insecty, because my design is already feeling a little bit like a bumblebee. But when I bring that antenna onto the front, then it really just starts to make it feel kind of like it's got the face of a beetle, and then the sort of like wings and the boosters on the side end up looking a bit like a bee. So it's all just sort of too much of one thing. So it just really doesn't work. So I'll probably end up deleting it at some point. But in this case, these sort of shapes and designs are really just coming from a lot of reference that I'm looking at, and also just a general sort of sense of designs that I have in my head from just looking at design and different references for a long time. So I can be a bit nerdy sometimes, and I can sit on the sofa next to my girlfriend looking at Pinterest for an hour or two about like kind of looking at like rockets and then or jets and car designs and things like that. And as I see things I like, then I stick them in folders. So if I then later on kind of want to figure out some sort of mechanical joint, or if I want to figure out a jet booster or like a propulsion jet like I am now, then I can just look at my Pinterest folder or a pure ref that I might have on my other screen, and just to see the sort of basic shapes and how they work in order to inform my design choices, because I'm obviously not an engineer. So I need those just to really kind of like help me to figure out what sort of shapes I would want to go with. Because I think the core to most of my design anyway, but most of the design that I've been taught about and what I look at, is to make sure that it's got a foundation in realism. Because then it would, it makes it much more believable for the artist when they, or for the, like the customer or the gamer or the viewer to really kind of understand the asset or understand the design if it's at least based in things they've seen before. So in this case, I'm kind of like looking at attack helicopters and thinking, how do they let air out and how do they pull air in? So if I'm thinking this big shape on the side of my asset is an air intake, then at the back it's got to push warm air out, and then it's got a darkened area of like hardened metal, which is designed to deflect the hot air that's coming out the back away from the vehicle. And at the moment what I'm designing is sort of like a pivot point. So I can imagine that if the drone is high up in the air and it dips fast down towards the street, then maybe the tail would pivot slightly back, like the tail on a lobster or something like that. I'm kind of thinking very much like I'm looking at dragonflies and creatures as well when I'm doing this design. So I'm sort of thinking, okay, if I show that there's a point at which the whole vehicle can kind of bend very slightly, one, it kind of brings a bit more believability because people see panel lines, and sort of this helps to believe that maybe at least close future manufacturing limitations mean that you would need panel lines and things like that. So quite often what you can see I'm doing now is I'm applying dark materials to areas, sometimes even if it's just going to be a hole or more modeling work, because it does the same for me in my render to use light and dark materials. Because what I'm really thinking is, does this give me a nice silhouette? Does it draw the eye to the area like I want it to, or does it become just too distracting? So rather than investing an hour's worth of modeling time into an area just to then decide I don't like the shape, I would rather take an area, block out the very basic shape, and then maybe make it dark, or if it's in a dark area, add something light in the middle, and then it will give me an idea of whether I like the composition in that space before really committing the design, like to the design in that area. So what I'm doing now is kind of adding more, because I'm still imagining it's quite a military strategic vehicle. I'm adding shapes that remind me of vehicles like jackals and mastiffs that are being used in Afghanistan, that have these kind of like quite sort of robust panel shapes sticking out in certain areas, and they help for things like adding areas of armor where maybe on the other side they have clips that would connect different ropes or cables or chains and things like that, or maybe they're for mounting things. So you can totally imagine that when you see these sort of shapes sticking out in different places, you can imagine it's armor that's been placed on top of the vehicle, which also has lots of sort of 45-degree angles, because that would help to deflect radar as opposed to bounce it back. So one of the things I was looking at when I was designing this drone was some of the more modern naval destroyers that the British and American military are using, and also one that I saw recently in Sweden, where they have lots of these kind of 45 or 33-degree angles all over the ship, and it means that when radar comes in across the water or from the air, it's more likely to bounce the radar away as opposed to back at the sender, and then that helps to give it more of a sort of stealthy feel. So that's why I'm using a lot of these kind of 45-degree angles, especially where I just highlighted these kind of big 45-degree bevels. And then sort of the same with the jet boosters and things like that. And then I want to give this sort of look of 5 centimeter thick kind of plating that can be replaced all over the drone, which is why there's always this layer of kind of extra polys sticking out all the way around the drone, where it looks like these areas could be replaced if the thing was damaged, if it was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade or something like that. So at this point I'm thinking mainly it's a lot about the silhouette. I need to give it the feel that it has the jet engine on the back, and then the air is pulled through the vents on the side. But then there also needs to be some sort of fuel and power generation sitting inside the drone that's powering that jet on the back and needs to be cooled by the vents. So I need to give it the sense of bulk that it requires for let's say the gamer for now, for them to believe that when they see it, this is a big, chunky, working vehicle that then also has these extremities on the outside that are used for monitoring civilians or moving the vehicle. And then they're powered by this sort of power generation unit inside. So one of the things I'm also thinking about while doing this design is that I want these kind of huge discs on top to look like they use I guess levitation technology to keep the drone in the air. So these are like the rotor blades on an Osprey, or the single rotor blade that would be on a helicopter. So these would be at either side, and they would basically spin non-Newtonian fluid around through the inside, and then that would create kind of its own gravity, or it would kind of at least create a force that could defy gravity to keep the vehicle in the air. And this is where I'm kind of basing at least the very basic design of this on YouTube videos or on Wikipedia articles about technology that people are always kind of theory crafting or have been looked into in the past. And that's just because even though it's kind of my own stupid design, I'm still basing it on something that smart people at some point have thought about, and maybe even if it's failed, it adds an element of believability to my design, and also helps to inform kind of what I should be doing. So then once I have those kind of blocked out, then I'm thinking I have these jet thrusters on the sides, and they can sort of tip in and out, or they can rotate on the hydraulics that I'll put underneath, and they help to sort of boost the jet in any direction. So they can tip back to accelerate, and they can sort of move with the jet. The jet engine on the back is obviously the main kind of thrust of the vehicle. So if the vehicle sort of tips slightly forward like an attack helicopter, then the jet would kind of thrust, and the vehicle could move forward at a few hundred miles an hour. But the boosters on the side would also be then helping to adjust the general direction that the vehicle's moving in. It would also help to vertically sort of boost it up and down like a Harrier jump jet. I've also designed these kind of like little fins that you can see on the back, just around the jet. I'm thinking that these help to, they can either spread all the way out and open up, similar to an air brake, and they can also close and tighten in around the jet in order to help to stop the energy from the jet like dissipating as soon as it leaves the jet. So maybe as the vehicle really accelerates, these fins can close up around the jet to help consolidate the energy that's coming out of it and help to push the jet forward at speed. But then also, as the jet slows down, they can spread right out, cause a lot of kind of air resistance and help to air brake the vehicle. And at the same time, maybe those little boosters at the front could tip forwards and boost in the opposite direction to which the vehicle was already moving. And then this kind of shape that I'm thinking on top, that I blocked in a second ago, that was more for, maybe it could be an access panel, or maybe it could be some sort of radar. But again, I'm just not really loving it. I've put it there for a minute, and then sometimes what I like to do is leave it alone for a few minutes or an hour or 2 hours, continue with the design, and then see whether it really fits into my general thought process later on. And if it doesn't, then I'll get rid of it. Rather than thinking right now, I'm not really sure, so I'll just get rid of it. Sometimes I feel like I just need to let things sit, see whether they fit in with the overall aesthetic, and if they don't, then kill it. So you can see at the moment, I'm thinking a lot about, I need to add small details in areas where I want to draw the eye. And then I want nice big open spaces so that I have a lot of room for the player's eye to actually relax. If I don't have those kind of negative spaces or those areas of rest, then it's very hard to create focal points out of the areas that are interesting and tell a story. So in this case, on this drone, for example, I'm blocking out a gun at the moment. So I would want the gun to be sort of high frequency, contrasting to the area that it's in. And then maybe have some sort of like nice kind of storytelling decals on it as well, which would really help to draw the player's eye to that element of the design and help to tell the story. Whereas if the whole design is covered in noise and covered in information and is very interesting, then the overall design becomes weaker because you're not kind of being drawn to these storytelling elements. So at the moment, I'm thinking this is kind of like the rough, rather like relatively large weapon that would be underslung, but you can see that the space around the weapon is relatively simple. I've put in this kind of big cylinder so you can get a sense of how the weapon would actually sort of pivot on the vehicle. So it's got a cylinder, like an upright cylinder that the gun is actually sat on that could rotate on the Z-axis in order to shoot left and right. But then it could also pivot on this big cylinder that's built into the bodywork that could pivot up and down. And then what I want to do is, now that I've placed it, is I want to keep this area around the gun itself kind of relatively simple, just to make sure that it's getting the kind of airtime, for want of a better term, that it deserves. And then, so the general rule I follow when I'm doing this is that I have kind of a 70-30 rule. So 70% of the vehicle for me needs to be nice open spaces, so like clean bodywork, and then 30% of it needs to be kind of noisy and lots of information and contrasting. So in this case, when I have my kind of overall design, it will be approximately 70-30. So it could be 60-40 or something like that. But in this case, because I'm using white and dark grey, then roughly kind of 30% of the vehicle will end up being detailed and dark grey, and then 70% will end up being much simpler and with this kind of white colour. And that helps to create an overall nice aesthetic with the vehicle. So it's got nice clean bodywork in a similar way to like a supercar or something that's just generally designed to look nice. But then also these dark contrasting elements, I need to know that when I have them, they need to have a sense of purpose. So I don't just want to have an area that's dark but it doesn't really make sense, or an area of high detail that doesn't make sense. Because sometimes I see, quite often, I'll see like nice designs, but maybe they'll have so much information going on that I just really don't know where to look. And sometimes they could potentially have so much story kind of drawn or modeled into the design that I'm really kind of not grabbing. I'm really not noticing one specific element that's helping me to think about the main narrative of this. So, for example, with this drone, I want you to see this drone and think, okay, this is a drone that's designed to fly around over a city. It can get in and out of different spaces, change direction quickly, go fast. But then also it needs to be able to keep an eye on the people, or notice people, or notice vehicles, or track enemies, or whatever it wants to track in the same way as UAV would right now. But then also maybe it needs to be able to do something about it. So it would have the gun underneath. So it's some very simple elements that I'm doing. It's like, it's got these big discs that make it look like it can fly. It's got different elements like wings on the back, and then these boosters on the sides that all make it look like it can fly. It's got this jet on the back, which is there to make it look like it's fast. So these elements are the first things that's telling me as a viewer that this is something that's kind of similar to like an Apache helicopter or an Orca from Command & Conquer. Then the next thing I want is slightly smaller elements for you to notice, like a camera right in the front of the face. And I plan on putting a big lens in the middle and probably some decal signage to really like make sure that it's quite obvious that this thing is a camera. And then you'll instantly think of this as, okay, this is a big flying kind of attack helicopter type thing, or at least just a helicopter type thing. But because it's got cameras built into it, now it starts to feel more like a kind of an advanced security camera, basically. And then the next element I want to add is the gun underneath. So then it looks like this is actually a dangerous vehicle. So it's kind of got speed, maneuverability, then it's got the surveillance equipment built into the front. And then on top of that, then it's got the underslung gun that is able to sort of like at least tackle some of the problems that the driver wants. So one other element I'm thinking about with this design is that I do want it to look like an unmanned drone. So at no point am I planning on designing windows into it, or cameras all around the body, or any kind of like access panels that make it look like you can climb into the vehicle, because I do want it to look like it's completely unmanned, and you could have someone sat in a police station somewhere, or maybe some sort of like slightly dodgy PMC base somewhere where they're sat with an Xbox controller just flying this thing around. I'm kind of imagining when I design it, I'm giving it lots of like sharp angles and generally quite kind of like angular shapes, because I do want it to look not like the friendliest design. I want it to look quite kind of vicious and lethal as well. So although it looks kind of a little bit like a big maneuverable guppy, I also want it to look like it could be quite dangerous. And that's because I want to imagine that when I'm designing something called a Reaper, that maybe it's designed by OTech Industries and they work as a private group, maybe in some dystopian city in the future, where they just decide when they want to if people are being criminals or not. So maybe they completely ignore what the police say because they're too big for the police, or maybe they work with the police. So that's kind of why I'm thinking I want this thing to look quite kind of dangerous, and then I want to give it the name Reaper, which sort of makes it feel kind of quite dangerous, and then give it guns and things like that. I don't necessarily want the vehicle to be the most heavily armed vehicle, because I want it to look like it's used in a kind of a civilian capacity. So maybe it flies around a city as opposed to flying around a war zone. But you could totally imagine that maybe this has even more weapons added to it, and you could have missiles mounted on top of the vehicle or in other places on the underside if you wanted to make it more dangerous. So obviously, as you can see on the side, on the underside of the thrusters, I'm just using dark materials again in order to kind of give silhouette. So I'm thinking as I'm doing that I'll probably model like different details into there. So maybe it'll be quite a hollow area with just elements of the kind of power generation underneath. But although in my head I'm thinking, okay, there'll be quite a lot of detail modeled in here, I can first of all just bring that kind of darker material in to help me just to get a sense of the overall composition, and if it feels like it makes sense, or if it's just going to make the area feel kind of too noisy and too busy before I commit to any of that. And now I'm kind of thinking about, how do I show that this gun is connected to this big pivoting area? And at some point I'll probably have to model into the center of it, just to give it another smaller cylinder inside to make it look like the outer area pivots around the inner area in order to rotate the gun. I'm also at the same time just kind of constantly refining the overall silhouette, because I don't want it to look too kind of like big and bloated on its underside. I want it to look like all of it's designed to control air in a specific way. So what I'll do is I'll maybe add dark areas to places, light materials to other places, and then also adjust the modeling to kind of refine the silhouette. And then what I've just done there is I'm kind of designing into it and saying, do I want a big hole here, or do I want to adjust this dark metal area to be something else? And currently when I see it in the render, I just don't like the result I'm getting, so that's why I've deleted it. And you can see that I've already deleted the area on top, where I was thinking maybe it could be an access panel or something, because I just wasn't liking that it broke up that nice big kind of clean area. So at the moment, again, I'm adding nice big space, but all I'm doing is, rather than modeling holes into things right now, I'm just kind of creating the overall shape and then extruding those faces in, and then applying a darker material to it and checking it out in my render. And the point of these areas is for the actual kind of like levitation discs to pivot from. So you can imagine that these discs need to actually connect to the vehicle and pivot up and down. So I need somewhere where there's going to be arms and also pivot shapes that are going to connect to the discs itself, and then they'll actually kind of enter the vehicle and then be powered and have hydraulics plugged into it and everything. So that's what I was just doing there. So now I'm also kind of refining the shape where I want the air intakes to look like they're kind of like drawing air in, potentially still creating heat around that area. So I want dark materials, and I'll probably have noisy kind of like grids or grates on the vents to draw your eye, because it's just another element of, if I add noise to this area and it's quite clean around it, then the player is likely to look at it and then probably quite early understand that that's an air vent for the engines of the vehicle, because they've seen things like helicopters and planes so many times before. So now I'm basically adding the arms for these levitation discs to pivot from. And although I can see that they would be kind of on these arms at the moment, I'm sort of struggling to think of, if these things are stationary, it feels like it'd be too brittle. Like, you could imagine this thing turning fast and banging one of its levitation discs on the corner of a building. It's much more likely to destroy the whole vehicle. Whereas if I was to add some sort of tube for the disc to pivot from, then it would be able to turn a corner, potentially bang one of its discs, treat the pivot point like it's more of a suspension, suck up a lot of the kind of energy and inertia that's coming from the crash, and then it would probably not just take half the vehicle off. It would be able to survive like at least a minor crash and things. But also it would give it the opportunity to maybe pivot the discs in different directions. So if the whole vehicle needs to kind of levitate but be tipped to one side or another, then both discs could pivot in different directions in order to adjust the way that it moves. And you probably noticed already that I killed the antenna on the front already, because it was just starting to feel kind of so insectoid. So at the moment all I'm doing is I'm cleaning up my modeling where I made some mistakes on the jet, just because I guess I broke the symmetry. So I'm just kind of replacing that, refining the shape a little bit whilst looking at reference. And then this is pretty much me happy with at least the first stage of my blockout, checking out the render and feeling happy.